More. Thank you, Ruti. Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Taylor, the editor of Jewish Renaissance magazine, and I'd like to welcome you to our Bloomsday event. So we're just waiting for a few more people to come in, but if you can turn off your mics, and we will begin. Okay, so as I say, welcome to our Bloomsday event. Bloomsday is a celebration that takes place in Dublin and around the world every year to mark Thursday, the 16th of June, 1904. So why is that day significant? That's the day depicted in Ulysses, the groundbreaking novel of the great Irish writer James Joyce. The novel follows the life and thoughts of its central character, Leopold Bloom, from 8 a.m. on the 16th of June through to the early hours of the following morning. So if I'd been able to visit Dublin today, I might have been served a breakfast of liver and grilled kidneys, the same breakfast that Leopold Bloom eats in Ulysses. I might have bumped into people on the street dressed in long Edwardian dresses, bow ties, and straw boaters. And I would have had the chance to go to readings or performances or see films or cabaret based on the book, maybe do a Ulysses tour of the city or go to a street party or a party in a pub. I can't be there this year, sadly. So instead, we thought we'd invite all of you to our own street party here on Zoom tonight, because Leopold Bloom, of course, was also a Jewish character. Although this being Joyce, nothing is ever straightforward. The character's father was Jewish, his mother was an Irish Protestant, and Bloom himself was baptized 3 times. Nevertheless, Bloom is perhaps one of the most famous fictional Jewish characters that's ever been written. And although controversy has raged for many decades over exactly who he was based on, how Jewish he really is, and how Joyce might have come across Jews in the first place, we thought today of all days would be an excellent moment to kick off an exploration of Ireland's real Jewish history, culture, and present-day community. And that's the topic of the current issue of Jewish Renaissance magazine, where we trace the island's Jewish connections from the 19th century to the present day. And I'm delighted to welcome here tonight some of the people who helped me put our Jewish Island section together. With their help, we'll trace Ireland's Jewish history across the north and south of the island, debunk some myths along the way, I think, listen to some poetry and music, and hear from you, our audience, with any questions you have for our panel. So please turn off your mics and be ready to send in any comments or questions on the chat function on Zoom. Fill up your glasses with Guinness or whiskey and let's welcome our guests. So first we've got Ruti Lachs. We just heard her playing her piano accordion. She is a musician, writer and teacher who lives in Cork. Her research into Cork's Jewish history has led to several musical projects, including A Different Kettle and Green Feather Boa. And most recently, she's created an online walking tour of Jewish Cork. Steven Jaffe was born in Belfast and now lives in London. In his work with the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the Jewish Leadership Council, he represents the small Northern Irish Jewish community. He's also the director of Belfast Jewish Heritage. And we have Natalie Wynn, who grew up in Dublin and is based there as a historian affiliated to the Herzog Centre for Jewish and Near Eastern Religions and Culture at Trinity College, Dublin. She specialises in Irish Jewish history and identity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And finally, we have Simon Lewis, who has his foot in many camps, perhaps. He grew up in Dublin, where his mother is from. His father is from Belfast, and he now lives in Carlow in Southern Ireland. He is a primary school head teacher and a poet. His debut collection, Jewtown, which uncovers the Jewish history of Cork, was published in 2017. And his second collection, Our Men, was published in 2018. We'll be hearing some poetry from Simon later tonight. So it's lovely that you're all with me tonight, panel, and let's begin with Ruti. Over to you, Ruti.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's lovely to be part of this Jewish Renaissance event. Okay, a Liverpool-born Jewish musician walks into a bar in Cork and says, excuse me, do you have klezmer here? Do you have klezmer here? And the barman replies, we do, yeah. And we also have Guinness, Beamish and Murphy's. That's a true story, although maybe a bit random. But is there a link? So Bloomsday today, and I thought I will tell you maybe a little bit about Cork Jewish history, but I thought because it's Bloomsday and Simon can tell you maybe more about Cork Jewish history and you can find out about it in other ways. But I was wondering, is there a connection? Bloomsday, James Joyce, Ulysses. is all about Dublin. But there is a tenuous connection with Cork and with Jewish culture and history in Cork. And I'd like to spend the next few minutes having a look at that. So, of course, James Joyce wasn't Jewish, although when I said to somebody I'm doing a Bloomsday event, they said, oh yeah, James Joyce was Jewish, wasn't he? But no, James Joyce wasn't Jewish. But if you read any book about Jewish history, you will find mention of Joyce and his invention, Ireland's most famous Jew, Leopold Bloom. So Bloom was created by Joyce, but James Joyce wasn't from Cork, and nor was Leopold Bloom. But Corkonians, we are a proud people in Cork. And of course we claim James Joyce as part of our history. And Corkonians also have memories of a historic and thriving Jewish community here in the city. So let's see what the connections are between Joyce, Bloom and Cork. James Joyce's father was born in Cork, and although James Joyce was born in Dublin, he must have had a soft spot for his paternal city because he came down to Cork at some point and looked to open a cinema here, which would have been really handy because if he'd opened a cinema here, he could have shown the films of Cork-born Jewish filmmaker Louis Marcus, and that would have been a really good connection between Joyce and Jewish Cork. However, he didn't open a cinema here, as far as I know. But Louis Marcus's brother was David Marcus, and David Marcus was a writer and an editor, and he wrote novels set in Jewish Cork. And his sister, Mina, taught piano back in the day. I think we're talking about the 1930s, 40s, 50s, maybe even into. So she taught piano, which I do myself as well. So you can see already there's loads of tenuous connections between Joyce and Cork. Danielle, could we have the first slide, please? Thank you very much. Danielle is being fab. Great. So this plaque, which I will read it to you. Well, it says it in big above, doesn't it? James Augustine Joyce, 1827 to 1866. Grandfather of James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, resided in this house. James A. Joyce was an officer of the Cork Corporation. Remember that bit, that's important. He was an officer of the Cork Corporation by whom this plaque was provided in 1984, and 1984 is another clue. So, James Joyce's grandfather lived in the house, and this plaque is set in the ground outside a house in Cork, and it's on the corner of Anglesey Street and Hibernian Road. Now, if you follow Hibernian Road to its end, which is less than half a kilometre, and then you turn left, and then you kind of veer off to your right a little bit, you come to Shalom Park and Hibernian Buildings. Hibernian Buildings is the area known locally as Jewtown, where many Jews lived in the time of Joyce. And Shalom Park was built on an area of ground which was donated to the Cork City Council, aka Cork Corporation, by Cork Gasworks in the 1980s. The very same decade when this plaque was provided was the year that the Gasworks gave the land to Shalom Park. There you go. I told you it was a bit tenuous, didn't I? Okay, we don't need to see that plaque anymore. So I'll tell you another connection. Thank you, Danielle, you're brilliant. So in 1893, 11-year-old James Joyce accompanied his father to Cork to oversee the selling of one of his family's last properties in Cork, which was Joyce's Court in White Street. Now, White Street, by a strange coincidence, White Street is now the site of a new housing estate. And before that was built last year. And it was built on top of a previous car park, which had formerly been the site of a bacon curing factory, amongst other businesses. And previous to that, it was a Jewish cemetery in the 1700s, so 300 years ago, for Sephardic, when the first Sephardic Jewish settlers came to Cork. So there you go. Joyce's father owned a house in White Street, and prior to that, 150 years earlier, it was a Jewish cemetery in that area. By a strange coincidence, another strange coincidence, there's a street, so White Street is there and Douglas Street is here, right? And there's a pub in Douglas Street, and I used to live there, not in the pub, but in Douglas Street. And this pub at the corner of Douglas Street and White Street is called the Gables. And back in the day, in 2019 until early 2020, a klezmer music session, a Jewish music session, took place in that pub near White Street every Tuesday for a year or more, pre-COVID. Amazing connection between Joyce and White Street and Jewish contemporary Cork. So we hope and pray that this lovely session will start up again. But meanwhile, I'd like to share with you a short video of a project that I facilitated in Bandon. Bandon's a small town with, I haven't discovered any Jewish connections with Bandon yet, so I had to make one. So it's about 45 minutes drive from Cork City, and I did an intergenerational project there. We called it Songs for Our Times, and it was a group of older people in a daycare, adult daycare, and children in a primary school, 10, 11-year-old children. And the children in the primary school are actually from about 15 different cultural backgrounds or more. So this is about a 2.5 minute little video just showing you something about that wonderful project. So Danielle, are you able to share that second slide? Thank you.
The idea to do an intergenerational project came about 8 years ago, where we get a group of willing school children who want to make music and older people who want to make music, and I've worked with both groups. Then we get together and we do a concert. But what's really lovely is that we also get together at an earlier phase. Then we talked about, you know, what it must be like moving to another country. And maybe it's strange, but maybe it's also really good. So we're going to have some original songs. How amazing, wide green countryside. How do people live this day? What are we coming to? Over the long years.
Thanks, Danielle. So I should have said that the premise of the project or how we started up to get to those original songs was that I suppose I talked a little bit about my own experience of being Jewish in a country that wasn't my own. And, you know, that started the ideas bouncing around that then led to those songs about fitting in or not fitting into a new place and how that must be. And the children learnt how to sing Alla Brida in Yiddish as well, which was great, as well as learning the I-I-Is. I was brought up in Liverpool, but I moved to Ireland in my early 20s, and this mirrors the experience of many Cork Jews who were born in the 30s to the 50s, and as young adults, they moved to England, Scotland, Dublin, Israel, the US, and beyond. When I started my research into the Cork Jewish community 4 years ago, I only knew 2 Cork-born Jews. It was 2017, the synagogue had closed the year before, and the last Jewish man standing, Fred Rosehill, had passed away that year. I started the research actually because I was going to write a musical play set in the Cork Jewish community in the early 1900s, as you do, as one does. So I'm now going to perform you one song from the musical play. The play is called Green Feather Boa, and this song is Grandma Came to Ireland, and it's got some I-I-I's at the end that you can all join in with. Grandma came to Ireland from Lithuania. My Zayden knew some people who'd moved here many years before that rainy Thursday, when they landed at long last at Queenstown Pier, June 16th, 1904. Well, that's Bloomsday, isn't it? My mother can't remember her first few years in Cork, a city full of churches, not like Acmeon where she was born, and her first memory, Grandma Hannah singing songs to her in Yiddish, songs about the pogroms and the wars. Schlaf mein Fegele, mach zu dein Egele, schlaf mein Kind, schlaf, mach zu dein Egele, mein teure Fegele, schlaf mein Kind, schlaf. My mother grew up Irish. Her parents spoke between themselves only in Yiddish. They read the local paper trying to learn English. When mother went to school, she learned some words in Irish. And in the synagogue, the prayers were all in Hebrew. And so it came to pass that by the age of 14 and a half, there were 4 languages she knew. Grandma grew up Irish. It didn't matter to her friends that she was Jewish. It made no difference except Saturday mornings. She went to synagogue and went to Cheder Sunday. When her friends all went to mass, ay, 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 Thank you.
Yeah!
Thanks very much. That's not my history, it's the history of a character in a play, and the play is called Green Feather Boa. So hopefully that will make it to the stage in a couple of years when theatre's back in force. But meanwhile, I will be presenting it at the Tzitzit Fringe Festival in October. So I'm sure you'll all hear about that through Jewish Renaissance and other ways. As well as finishing writing the play, during lockdown, I produced the Cork Jewish Culture Virtual Walk that Rebecca mentioned. There is a picture of it, I think, on the next slide, Danielle, if you want to show that to people. It's on YouTube, it's on the website, it's a 15-minute video, and the website address is there. So do have a look, and if it sparks any memories for any of you, please do feel free to get in touch. It's always good to learn more. Now, this project, the Cork Jewish Culture Virtual Walk, was supported by Cork City Council. Aha! The self-same Cork City Council, which used to be Cork Corporation, the same crowd that provided the plaque on the pavement. You see, so it's all connected. Thank you for sharing that video, that slide. Following the release of the video, I was contacted by a couple of hundred souls, some with Cork Jewish roots. And I've been having the most amazing year. And I now know more than just 2 Cork-born Jews. I know a lot of them. And I'm meeting regularly with them on Zoom. They're all over the world, as I said earlier. And also I'm meeting people who weren't born in Cork, but maybe their parents were. And I'm meeting people whose great-grandfather was the rabbi of Cork in 1910 and things like this. So it's just really amazing. And I seem to be collecting a bit of an archive of photos and stories and whatnot, which I'll be sharing ongoingly. I hope post-COVID I'll actually be leading some actual walking tours of Jewish Cork as well, with music and song and history and memories and the movement of feet on pavements like Leopold Bloom walked along the pavements of Dublin with his feet. We will hopefully be able to walk together along the pavements of Cork. And I will run these walks. And the reason I'm doing this is because I feel it's really important to maintain some continuity. Even though I have had some funding from Cork City Council, it wouldn't be enough to keep you going on its own. So my real reason for doing this is because, you know, the old community, which was an Orthodox community, which had a shul, which was called the Cork Hebrew Congregation, is all but gone. It's very, very diminished. But there is a new community which has a reform flavour but welcomes Jews of all denominations. And it's the new Munster Jewish community, Cork Jewish community. And, you know, that is the future of Jewish life in Cork. And I just feel like it's so important to maintain a connection and hopefully a not tenuous connection, a real connection. And as a musician and writer, and I hope that I can do some of that. And hopefully you'll come to Cork and do the walk, and please do get in touch with me and stay connected. Thank you very much.
Oh, Rebecca, you're muted.
Thank you, Ruti. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Ruti, for your marvelous music. I've just got down from dancing on the desk. It was really terrific. Wonderful stuff. And what exciting and creative things you're doing in Cork. And we'll be looking forward to hearing a lot more about what's coming up in the future. Watch out in Jewish Renaissance magazine for more information on that. That's great stuff. Thank you. We'll go now to London, where we're going to hear from Steven Jaffe. And Steven, you're going to talk about your Belfast heritage.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I feel a bit of a gatecrasher, you know. I can't say that James Joyce or Leopold Bloom ever set foot in Belfast, as far as I am aware. But if he had have done, and if the book had been set in Belfast, I assure you it would be twice the length and twice as contentious as the book actually is. But if he had arrived in Belfast on the 16th of June, 1904, I can tell you he would be in a city with a Jewish Lord Mayor, Sir Otto Jaffe. Yes, you heard right, Jaffe, a very renowned namesake of mine, but sadly not a relation, because he was one of Belfast's wealthiest linen merchants. But he was Lord Mayor in 1904. Belfast in that year also had a spanking new synagogue, just opened on Annesley Street at Carlisle Circus, bottom of the Antrim Road, and that was to be the community's only synagogue for the next 60 years. Also in 1904, Belfast's Chevra Gemara, that's its Talmud Learning Society, completed for the first time its 11-year cycle of daily study of the Talmud. And there was a Siyum Gadol, a great party to celebrate that fact. Belfast as a bastion of orthodoxy at that time. I am sure that Bloom would have popped into the Young Men's Hebrew Association in Belfast, which had its club rooms in Donegal Street, Belfast. So Belfast was one of the fastest growing cities in the 19th century, really driven by two industries, the linen industry and shipbuilding. And you won't be surprised to learn that Jews were very much involved in both of those. I've mentioned Sir Otto Jaffe, who was the Lord Mayor. His father, Daniel, was the founder of the Belfast Jewish community. He was from Hamburg, he was a textile merchant, and he arrived in Belfast in the 1850s with his family to export Irish linen across the world. And in the 1860s, he was joined by many other German Jewish textile merchants. It was the time of the American Civil War, and there was a blockade on cotton. And all of a sudden, Irish linen becomes one of the most important textiles in world markets. So this attracted to the growing town of Belfast a number of Jewish merchant families. And there was enough to have a minyan. We hear about the first services in Belfast in the 1860s. And indeed, a congregation is formed in 1869, and its first synagogue is opened right bang in the center of the city in what is Great Victoria Street. And these were very substantial merchants in many cases. They sold linen right across Europe. Otto Jaffe himself crossed the Atlantic over 50 times, selling Irish linen across North America. And they left behind very substantial buildings. They've come to Belfast at the back of our city hall. There's a 10-square hotel, a very distinguished building, and that was the premises of Jaffe Brothers. The Linen Hall Library, which is the oldest library in Belfast, the premises it's now in was initially a Jewish linen business called Moore and Weinberg. So they've left certainly lots of buildings. The Jewish community that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, we originated from further east in Europe. We came from Poland and Lithuania and arrived in Belfast as part of that huge movement of people from Eastern Europe, of course, in most cases trying to get to America. But by the late 19th century, turn of the century, there was perhaps 800 Jews living in Belfast, and they lived mostly in the north of the city, around where I said that synagogue was opened in 1904, at the bottom of the Antrim Road. And they had their own school, they had their own Jewish national school in that part of the city, their own butchers, of course, a kosher fishmonger, grocers. It was a little shtetl in Belfast, but with some distinguished people attached to it. And I have to tell you that in 1918, Belfast had living in it a future chief rabbi of Israel, a future president of Israel, and a future foreign minister of Israel. Now, I have to say New York can't say that and London can't say it, but Belfast can. And this, of course, is the Herzog family, where Isaac Herzog holds his first position as rabbi of the Belfast Jewish community before he's appointed in Dublin. But while he was there, his son Chaim is born in Belfast. And although he was only 6 months old when he went to Dublin, I always say if a man was conceived in Belfast, born in Belfast, and circumcised in Belfast, he is a Belfast man. So we are very proud of Chaim Herzog, and of course his son, who has just become also president of Israel. So who was this other man, the foreign minister of Israel, who lived in Belfast at that time? Well, incredibly, it was a boy called Aubrey Solomon, who became much better known by the name of Abba Eban, Israel's leading diplomat of the 20th century. He happened to be an evacuee during the First World War, living just off the Antrim Road. And believe it or not, Chaim Herzog and Abba Eban were much later on to marry sisters. So they became brothers-in-law. Both started off their connection through Belfast. So that's quite an amazing set of very famous people. But beside those famous men was a very significant woman, Sarah Herzog, who started her married life in Belfast, goes on to become a very important person in her own right. The largest hospital in Jerusalem, geriatric hospital, is named after her. And she is the founder of the Emunah, the largest women's Jewish movement in the world. As I said, she began her married life in Belfast. On the same street as the Herzogs, just a few houses down slightly earlier, was a man called Maxim Litvinov. Anyone heard of him? He became foreign minister of the Soviet Union under Stalin. His sister was living in Belfast. So I've told you in that tiny little bit of a regional provincial city, 2 foreign ministers, a president and a chief rabbi. It's not bad, is it? It's a good start to any walking tour. And like Ruti, I would love to be hosting you in Belfast at some point. So the history of the Belfast Jewish community, I would say, is very much like many other regional Jewish communities in the British Isles, but with 3 distinctive factors that makes it slightly different. Firstly, it is just that little bit more isolated than many other Jewish communities. To get to its closest main Jewish centres in Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, of course, you've got to cross the sea. Dublin is 100 miles to the south and sometimes across a volatile border. So it is just a little bit more isolated than many Jewish communities, perhaps. Also, it's established within its own jurisdiction. In other words, Northern Ireland, for much of its history, has its own parliament, has its own laws. And allied to that fact is the Jewish community was situated in a very distinct and at times challenging social and cultural setting in terms of wider society. So Northern Ireland, of course, famous for the Protestant and the Catholic, and how the Jewish community navigated its course in that particular setting is a major theme of Belfast Jewish history. So that self-sufficiency, I think, leads to a very strong Belfast Jewish identity. I should say not just Belfast, because in 1904, you could have also joined the Jewish communities in Londonderry, the Londonderry Hebrew congregation, and the Lurgan Hebrew congregation in County Armagh. They both folded certainly by towards the end of the Second World War, the Lurgan community even earlier than that. But an amazingly strong Jewish identity. Wherever Belfast Jews go, we carry that identity with us. And there's a very thriving group called Jewish Belfast, which is online at the moment, but which has held many kind of reunions and other events over the years, because we never lose that identity. It's something very special to us. So at its height, the Belfast Jewish community numbered 1,200 people. Today, I'm going to shock you and say that the numbers of members of the synagogue in Belfast is down to about 60. Sadly, the average age would be well in advance of 60. It's mostly retired people. We wait to see what the census figures will say for 2021. 2011, there was about 335 people claiming Jewish faith in Northern Ireland. So what caused that decline? The Troubles did not help. Naturally enough, you won't be surprised. I always say, growing up in Belfast in the 1980s, I was in the right place at the wrong time, an absolutely beautiful place to live, but that we were right in the heart of the Troubles. And about 1 in 4 of the victims of the Troubles was in that area of North Belfast where the synagogue and most of the Jews were then located. So, like Ruti, all is not lost. There is Jewish life in Belfast. We still, in our case, have a functioning synagogue, at least pre-COVID. We've got a minister. We have in many ways, a small community, but one which punches its weight in terms of its standing in Northern Ireland. And also we're looking to preserve our heritage and culture. And I'm delighted to say that Belfast Jewish Heritage got support this year through the Northern Ireland Office and the National Lottery funding to be part of Northern Ireland's centenary commemorations. And we've got funding to really identify, preserve and promote the Jewish heritage of Northern Ireland. And we'll be looking to do that in many different ways, and would really welcome the support of Jewish Renaissance, of its readers, as we promote that initiative. So thank you very much for including the North, because we're sometimes left out in this event, and it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for telling us about this distinctive community with such a rich and a history that goes back a very long way. That was so interesting, and I'd love to hear more about what you're doing to mark the centenary and the work that the Heritage organisation will be doing. That would be great to hear more. Maybe you can tell us a bit more at the end. So let's go back to the south now to Natalie Wynn in Dublin, who's going to talk to us a bit about the history of the community there.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen before I start. Okay, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Dublin, of course, but I do first want to relate it back to its primary historical context as part of the so-called provincial network of British Jewish communities, which is a collective term for the communities that were established outside the Anglo-Jewish centre in London. It's often forgotten that the Irish communities are part of a bigger Jewish picture. As an unexpected presence in a small peripheral country that tends to be seen from outside as parochial, insular, and monoculturally Catholic, Irish Jews are often regarded as somehow unique or quirky or quaint, as different from other Jewish communities elsewhere, and not subject to the same historical forces that operated in other places. In fact, there's a lot about the Jewish experience in Dublin that's typical of the British provincial Jewish story in general. And this is particularly true at the time of the fictional Irish Jew Leopold Bloom, whom we're celebrating this evening. And in the photo on the slide, you can see the late Gerald Davis, a local Jewish artist and Joyce aficionado, dressed as Leopold Bloom for Bloomsday, as he used to do every year. Ireland is a small outpost, or was a small outpost, on the international map of mass migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And its communities lay on the circuit that was trodden by many new immigrants as they travelled around the UK in search of their forever home, so to speak, the best place for them to settle, establish themselves, and raise their families. However, from the time that Ireland gained its independence in 1922 until very recently, its British past has been swept under the carpet as part of a process of building an Irish nation with a distinct Irish identity. And Jews, like other Irish citizens, have lost or forgotten the British aspect of their past. And it's important to note as well that the Britishness of the different Irish communities would have varied according to the city or town in which they were located. Dublin and Belfast would have been very British cities, while smaller cities like Cork and Limerick, or the towns where other Jews were found, would have been more Irish in character. And this would have impacted on perhaps a little bit on how Irish Jews saw themselves, although they would primarily have identified as British in the time of Bloom. The only way to understand the Irish community at this time, therefore, I would argue, is to understand them as part of the British provincial network. They didn't function as a distinct Irish subgroup within that network, but each community had its own separate relationship with the central Anglo-Jewish authorities in London. And that would have been where they looked for support and guidance such as was available to them. All of the Irish communities, to differing extents, would have followed the same general trajectory as most British provincial communities. This would have begun with dispersal from bigger centres to avoid the formation of visible foreign Jewish enclaves, followed by a period where the communities established themselves and created some kind of infrastructure depending on their size. If they were large enough, they would have had a period of where they flourished. And after a time, this process gradually began to reverse itself with an ingathering towards the bigger centres with better equipped, more viable Jewish infrastructure. And consequently, we would see the dwindling and disappearance of many of the small provincial outposts, such as many of the Irish communities. We know very little about Dublin's Jewish history until the mid-19th century. There was a sporadic Jewish presence in the city since the Middle Ages, but no recognisable community until the late 17th century, where we see a small Sephardic community, which was associated with Crane Lane, which you can see in the top left, in the photo on the top left. So Crane Lane is now part of the fashionable Temple Bar area, but at this time, it was close to the city's docklands. The Sephardim were soon overtaken by Ashkenazi incomers from Central and Western Europe, which is part of a very familiar story of Jewish migration everywhere. In the 18th century, the next synagogue could be found in Marlborough Green, which was located near to the iconic Customs House, which you can see in the photo on the bottom right. The location of both of these synagogues indicates the community's commercial orientation at this time and what would have attracted Jews to Dublin in this period. The community had some association with the Bevis Marks synagogue at this time, and Bevis Marks helped them to acquire their first cemetery in Ballybock in 1718 on the north side of Dublin. The modern community can be traced back to the establishment of the Dublin Hebrew Congregation, or DHC, in and around 1822 by the Ashkenazi community. And at this point, we begin to find some tangible information from contemporary Jewish sources, such as the DHC's first laws, which were published in 1839, and the Jewish Chronicle, which featured occasional reports on Dublin between the 1840s and the 1870s. The DHC was located at this time in a former chapel in Mary's Abbey in the North Inner City, which you can see on the left. This is the original building, with apologies for the state of the photo. And on the right, you can see what the site looks like now. This synagogue had a capacity of approximately 90 people, and its small membership is reflected in infrequent services, which were held mostly on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and also in the degree of compulsion that was required to ensure the smooth running of services and communal functions and the community cash flow. The laws and reports indicate a rather stuffy anglicized community with a heavy Christian influence, and there was a strong emphasis on order and decorum, as you can see from this excerpt from a report of a bar mitzvah in the Jewish Chronicle, which appeared in 1856. So the DHC was at this time a rather typical anglicized provincial Jewish community. And in fact, it was praised by the Jewish Chronicle as being exemplary in terms of its modern Orthodox character and practices. Despite its stuffiness, the congregation comes across as cozy and close-knit, and it was led by a small nucleus of dedicated long-serving officers. By the 1870s, observers believed the Dublin community to be quietly dwindling away, even though Ireland was seen as a great place for Jews, as there was supposedly none of the same persecution and intolerance that was to be found elsewhere, except, of course, in Scotland and Wales, which make the same claims. However, everything changed radically with the arrival of East European Jews from the early 1880s. Though Ireland never saw mass migration on the same scale as other parts of the UK, this was still significant and sufficient enough, relatively speaking, to radically change the local landscape, both within the Jewish community and beyond, by making Jews a visible minority in Dublin and other parts of the country for the first time. And this tested the general self-image of tolerance, which was a notion that James Joyce interrogates through his character of Leopold Bloom. The East European influx also tested the existing communal infrastructure, which would have been minimal. And of course, it was found to be woefully inadequate. At this point, it has to be said, there were only around a dozen of the original Anglicized families left in Dublin. Also, it was not the kind of religious and social infrastructure the newcomers would have been accustomed to in terms of social, charitable, and religious support structures. So they set about building this up for themselves. This began with religious institutions to support their more traditional minhag or practice. And of course, the community also had to support all of the different personalities and egos that were to be found. And this is a familiar story. So the congregation or the community fractured into multiple small congregations or chevrot, which came and went according to their economic and numeric viability. And there was perhaps a maximum of 9 chevrot at one point in the late 19th, early 20th century for just 1,500 Jews. There were a number of attempts to reunify the community, such as the relocation of the DHC to a purpose-built synagogue on Adelaide Road in 1892, in the photo on the top left. and there was the establishment of the United Hebrew Congregations in 1908, which you can see in the bottom left, which had the ambition of replacing the Chevrot, but didn't succeed. So there were both positive and negative effects of accelerated immigration. On the one hand, a rich and impressive communal infrastructure was developed to ease immigrants' transition to their new homeland. But on the other hand, this fractured into a multiplicity of overlapping societies and organizations that defied all attempts to systematize anything. Arguably, this repeated fracturing of the community was one of the things that undermined its viability in the long term. The mid-20th century was a kind of golden age for Dublin Jews, where the social, cultural, and religious infrastructure was thriving. And the community was in many respects self-contained and tight-knit, and was gradually becoming more prosperous and middle class. Most of those who were involved in the Dublin Jewish community at this time would have very fond memories. However, the founding of the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation, which you can see on the right in 1946, led to further bitter internal divisions within the community that are only now in the process of becoming healed. And again, this is a very familiar story from Jewish communities the world over. Though Jewish numbers began to dwindle off after their peak in 1946, this only really began to be felt in the 1980s and 90s, when the vast communal infrastructure was no longer viable and gradually began to shrink back to practically nothing. Now, unfortunately, we're at a point where the community is faced with serious existential issues, and the communal leaders are, to an extent, firefighting and struggling to build things back up from almost rock bottom. Their biggest challenge, perhaps, is to find some common ground between the remnants of the old community and a new, quite sizable Israeli contingent in order to secure some kind of collective Jewish future in the city. We also have new forms of Jewish identity and community emerging in Ireland that are challenging the old norms and perceptions, such as the Munster Jewish community that Ruti mentioned. So it's clear that we need to think about Jewish identity for the future in Ireland in more diverse and creative ways. I always try, like the other speakers, to be positive and end on a positive note, and to remember that although in the mid-1870s, Dublin's Jewish community was deemed to be on the brink of extinction, regeneration lay just around the corner. The community is again going through a period of transition. Change is always an unsettling thing, but equally change is important for survival. And hopefully the changes that we're seeing at the moment will lead to something new and better for the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That was so interesting and really giving us a flavour of the community and its history, which goes back, I hadn't quite realised, we mentioned it very briefly in the magazine, but that it goes right back to the 17th century. That was lovely. Thank you very much. Let's go to Simon now in Carlow, who is going to give us some poetry, I think, and tell us a little bit about his own heritage. So Simon Lewis.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and hi everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thanks also to Aviva and Danielle for the invitation to speak with you this evening. I must say, being Irish and having a Jewish heritage is great on Bloomsday. To be honest, it's the one day in the year where I know I'm going to be invited somewhere fun. So and this year I seem to be virtually in the UK, which is a nice treat for me. Last year actually was the first time I was invited for Bloomsday celebrations in the town I live in, which is Carlow. Carlow has a thriving Jewish population of 2, and I was the person who doubled the population when I moved down here nearly 20 years ago, and we're just waiting to increase by another 50% any day soon. I have a kind of a link to all three major cities, let's say, where there is a Jewish communities, insofar as like most Irish Jewish people, my family originally came to Ireland through Cork via Lithuania, and my great grandparents were born there. Also on my mum's side, they moved to Dublin eventually via another small town, Cavan, which is just slightly south of Northern Ireland. And then my dad's side is Belfast. My dad is Malcolm Lewis, who would have grown up and born and raised in Belfast, and he would have, I presume, moved down to Dublin after falling in love with my mum, and or to escape the troubles, or possibly both. I'm not quite sure. I'm pretty sure it's the former, of course. I guess I got going back to Cork. I had a slight fascination with Cork and Cork Judaism, because although I grew up in Dublin and went to school there and up until my adult life lived there, and I didn't. There's a lot of kind of books and information about the Dublin Jewish community, and I was quite interested in Cork because I couldn't find very much about it. And when I moved to Carlow, I joined a writing group, and because I didn't really know anyone, and a writing group sounded like a fairly decent idea anyway at the time to meet some people. And after a couple of years, one of the members of the group said, "Do you know what? You're quite, for Ireland anyway, you're quite exotic, with this Jewish background that you have. Why don't you write about your family, and write some poems about it?" And that's where I visited Cork for the first time, and the idea of Jewish Cork. And I just found one book by an academic in UCC, Dermot Keogh, and I found in that book 2 pages, which were basically a summary of some census records and a couple of other bits and pieces. And it opened up a whole new world to me about my ancestors, and I learned a lot about, that I didn't know before. I'm sure most Jewish people kind of share the same story of how Jewish people arrived to Cork. I'm surprised no one's mentioned it, because I think every Jewish person in Ireland would claim the same story of how Irish Jews landed in Cork, although it's probably not true. They were trying to get to America, specifically New York, and when the ship was sailing to New York, it stopped and docked in Cork, and the story goes that the captain said, "Look, welcome to Cork," and the Jewish people thought he said welcome to New York, and got off the ship, and were probably quite disappointed when they realized they weren't there at all. But I think that story probably isn't true. Anyway, when these Jewish people arrived in Cork, they had to settle, and so they did, and they started their lives off doing menial work, peddling being the main one. And like Natalie was just saying, Ireland, I suppose, celebrates itself by being a country which didn't particularly persecute this new Jewish population to a point. And I suppose when we're talking about Bloomsday and we're talking about 1904, I suppose it is worth mentioning the only a kind of a persecution against Jews in Ireland probably was happened in 1904, the Limerick pogrom that some of you may have come across, but let's not focus on that. I think what I might do is I'll read first poem about how Irish people generally, how I perceived the Irish population perceived this new group of people, as they called them, aliens, as was the terminology at the time, with no animosity whatsoever. So the first poem for my first book, Jewtown, is The Zoo, and I'll read it for you now. At Mass, we heard of aliens who travelled here by steamboat. People said they all had beards, darkened faces, and black clothes. Some complained they didn't pray to Our Lady. We were curious and took to Albert Road to see. We joined the crowds to get a glimpse, called out when we saw one pass. They looked at us, nodded, went on their way. A little one stuck out his tongue, and all the crowd laughed, stuck their tongues out too, until his father pulled him back. He smiled apologetically, but his eyes looked sorrier than any beast I'd ever seen. I knew these streets by the railroad and markets held people just like me. And when Father Care arrived, he shooed us off like animals. So that was my interpretation, let's say, of how this new community were perceived by Irish people. And the book goes on sort of reimagining this Jewish community who grew, and very, very similarly to what Stephen was saying, raised some famous Irish names, and Gerald Goldberg would have been probably the most famous of those Jews, the first Lord Mayor of the Republic of Ireland. Although possibly there was one before that, I think in the 1500s. If I'd say Natalie would know more than I would about that, but certainly in the modern era, Gerald Goldberg, but also a very important politician, and also someone mentioned David Marcus, who founded the New Irish Writing segment in the Irish press in the 1950s, and is responsible for a number of Irish short story writers. I'm sure who James Joyce would be very proud to have read, I'm sure. So I mean, as for me, I grew up in Dublin. I went to a Jewish school. I was raised in a kind of a hybrid Jewish family, if that's the best way of putting it. My dad came from an Orthodox Jewish community. My mum came from the liberal synagogue, and I was raised in the liberal synagogue but got a tinge of orthodoxy in my home life. We kept a kosher home and all the rest of it. And growing up as a kind of a young Irish boy in a Jewish school, I suppose I tried to maybe reflect on that a little bit in some of my poetry. And I'll just read one poem from which isn't to do with Jewtown. It's my other collection. I snuck in a Jewish poem into my second collection, Amen, which I hope you won't mind me reading. It's about Passover, and the poem is called Sacrificial Lamb, and it is based on an actual incident of my childhood, which is probably only interesting to me, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. That day, I was Bruce Grobbelaar, grasping shots from soccer stars of the 1980s. We were playing during Passover on Ian's estate with grass-stained knees, trophies of fingertip saves. After, we sat on the grass and boasted about overhead kicks, headers, volleys, debated who was the best player on the team as we learned each other's names. Bonded now, Padder ripped open a packet of blackjacks and offered them around. As my tongue turned inky black, I remembered the festival's laws and spat out licorice like blood. Dad told me God would understand and spare me, but that night I kept my eyes on the sky as it darkened, the doorpost not brushed with blood. It was certain death. So that is my second poem for you this evening. After I finished in school, I went to the only Jewish school in Ireland at the time, Stratford. I went through primary school and secondary school there. And eventually, probably disappointing for most Jewish people, I didn't become a doctor. In fact, I became a teacher, primary school teacher. And I now have the accolade of being the only primary school head teacher from a minority background in the whole country, which is nothing at all to be proud of, to be honest with you. And it does, I suppose, has shaped my career and my adult and my life around, I suppose, trying to fight for equality for minorities in the primary school sector in Ireland, where 95% of primary schools are controlled or run by either the Catholic Church or the Church of Ireland. I mean, I started my career off in a Catholic primary school, so I can say a very mean Hail Mary if you want me to. I won't. But it's kind of interesting, I suppose, being from a minority background in a very, very, very Christian sort of sector. In some ways, and bringing that to Joyce's work of Ulysses, I suppose I feel a little bit like Bloom in that landscape, and I'm no expert in Ulysses before anyone jumps on me, but there's a scene, I believe, in the book where there's a, I think it's in a pub, I could be wrong there, where someone is boasting how great Ireland was for never discriminating against the Jewish people in Ireland, and the response was, that's because there were no Jews to discriminate against, and that's kind of probably sum up my experience being a Jewish adult in Ireland in a very small town with no Jews and no one Jewish around me to work with. So that's a little bit about me, a bit of poetry, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Simon, flying the flag for Jewish Carlo there. Thanks so much, and for your beautiful poems. And if people are interested, they can see more about you and your work on your website. And can you order your poetry collections on the website?
You can go. My website is simonlewis.ie, which is probably the easier one to remember. But my publishers is where you'd have to buy the book, Dura Press, which is an Irish thing, but it's linked to from my website, so you'll find them there. Thanks a million.
Thank you. Okay, so while we've been talking and listening to our fascinating panel, we've had some questions come in. Please keep them coming. You can send them via chat and we'll pick them up and then ask you to ask our panel any questions you have. So I think let's start by going straight in with one of the questions we got is from Sharon in Sweden, and she's asking about whether Jews in Belfast took sides in the war. I presume you mean the Troubles. Sharon, have we got Sharon to hear her ask her question? And perhaps it's a very interesting question. Perhaps we can start off with Steven talking about how Jews were affected during the Troubles, and then
I'm sure
the
Sharon doesn't mean the Second World War. I'm sure she's referring to the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
I would have thought so. Yeah, Sharon, have we got Sharon? If not, maybe we'll just go straight to Steven. Okay.
Well, I very carefully tried to avoid the subject, but thank you, Sharon, for bringing it up. So if you look at the latest Jewish Renaissance magazine, I've written an article in it about the impact of partition on the Jewish communities across the island. And I make the point about the different narratives between Dublin Jews and Belfast Jews, which emerged fairly quickly from about the 1920s. For example, just to give you an instance of it, Chief Rabbi Herzog, who starts his career in Belfast, then becomes rabbi in Dublin. They make him Chief Rabbi of the new Free State. And he makes great play of his friendship with Eamon de Valera. They say he is a fluent Irish speaker. He's referred to as the Sinn Féin rabbi by some. So he's embedding himself in Irish nationalist culture. Now in Belfast, it's different. Our kind of corresponding major rabbinical figure in the history of the Belfast Jewish community was a man called Jacob Schachter, and he was rabbi in Belfast from the mid-1920s to the mid-1950s. He's writing letters on the occasion of birthdays in the royal family to the local newspapers. He invites the governor of Northern Ireland, the Queen's representative, to visit the synagogue during the festival of Shavuot. So you can see that these two communities are adopting different narratives in the circumstances of where they find themselves. Of course, it's a matter of Orthodox practice and perhaps Jewish practice wider, that you pray for the state that you're in, and therefore the Jews of Dublin prayed for the president of the Irish Free State and the Irish Republic, and in Northern Ireland the corresponding prayer is the prayer for the royal family. So in a formal sense, you can see some differences. The eruption of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in 1969 sadly wasn't the first time that the Jewish community had found itself in the midst of violent unrest there. I remember my grandmother telling me the stories of her childhood in North Belfast in the 1920s at the very time of partition of Ireland, and it was a time of, she remembered curfews, barricades, rioting, disturbances, sectarian murders, so sadly familiar to me from a later date. So the Jewish community, I would say, in Northern Ireland did not take a prominent part in politics. And this is probably for good reason. Throughout the history of the Northern Ireland Parliament and various assemblies and councils that succeeded it, I don't believe there was ever a Jewish representative elected to any of those. There were some councillors, tended to be from the Unionist Party, that was the dominant party, tended to be from the more liberal wing of that party. So the president of Belfast Synagogue, Harold Smith, was a Unionist councillor, but was not looked upon with favour by the emerging, what was then called the Protestant Unionist Party, which became the Democratic Unionist Party. And Eileen Paisley, who's the widow of the late Ian Paisley, stood against Harold Smith in a quite bitter council election. So the Jewish community, I would say, didn't take a very prominent part in politics. But if you're asking me to really get down to it, I would say the Jews in Northern Ireland were part of they owed their loyalty to the state, and it was a unionist state for much of that period. I don't think they had much truck for sectarianism. There was quite a vibrant left wing and socialist element within the community. A very well-known Belfast writer called Brian Moore, who's went to live in Canada, not by any means enamored with his Belfast childhood, but Brian Moore says one of the most liberating things that happened to him was when he came across the Jewish Dramatic Society. He was brought up in a very Catholic community in North Belfast, meeting Jewish people for the first time, many of them from a leftist perspective, was, he said, a liberating thing for him. Took him outside what he saw as a sectarian straitjacket that he had grown up in. So I'm sort of skirting around things, but giving you various insights into what is quite a complex situation.
Okay, maybe, thank you, Stephen. Maybe we should go to Natalie, because I know you had quite strong thoughts about this in the piece you wrote for the magazine about some of the myths around the sides that were taken. It would be great to hear from you on the subject, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I think Stephen touched on it. Actually, one of the observations I would have, which relating to Isaac Herzog and the narrative around Herzog's supposed nationalism, that work has been done on Herzog recently, actually by another scholar, an Irish historian or historian of Ireland, Eugenio Biagini, and he has argued that Herzog was actually acting in what he thought to be the best interests of the community. And I think that that's a very important point, that really when you drill down, there's no great evidence of this close friendship that's supposed to have existed between Herzog and Eamon de Valera. And a lot of the myths of Jewish nationalism or Irish Jewish nationalism are very hard to prove. There's no real evidence that, as it's claimed, that many of the community were nationalists. In fact, as I said earlier, all of the evidence points to the community having a British identity. And in fact, I've just been working with a memoir recently, and a number of times this writer of the memoir, who was an immigrant to Ireland in the late 19th century, refers to Ireland as England, and doesn't see any distinction between the two. And I think that that's something that really we've forgotten about, both on the Irish side and on the British side. that, you know, in building the state and in, you know, the Jewish community south of the border becoming Irish and adopting an Irish identity, we've imbibed the nationalist narrative, the Irish nationalist narrative. And whereas on the other side in Britain, it's kind of gradually been forgotten that Ireland was a part of the British provincial Jewish network. And there isn't yet enough dialogue really between Jewish scholars in Britain, in the British provincial communities and in Ireland, you know, just to reconstruct this a little bit more. So yeah, there's a lot to say about it really, but yeah, I think that would be my basic thoughts.
We did cover in the magazine the artist Estella Solomons, who was involved in an Irish paramilitary women's group, from what I understand from the article, and apparently hid Irish Republicans on the guise of painting their portraits in her studio. I mean, she's perhaps the most well-known of Republican sympathizers. Do you know more about her, Natalie? Is there more that you can tell us about her?
Well, I suppose the important thing to note about Estella Solomons and the few others, prominent Irish Jewish nationalists, such as Robert Briscoe or Michael Noyk, would be that they're atypical, and there's really no evidence that the larger part of the Jewish community supported the extreme separatist form of nationalism that Solomons, Briscoe and Noyk were involved in. Really, the Jewish community seems to have unsurprisingly gone along with the political mainstream, which supported the notion of home rule or devolution, which was under British patronage, or would have been under British patronage had it ever come to pass. After the 1916 Easter Rising, public opinion in Ireland became more hardline, and there was more support for separatist nationalism. And really, like I've always argued, that the Jewish community has written itself back into this kind of narrative of Irish nationalism in order to kind of indigenize itself and you know, make itself appear more authentically Irish. And you know, I would feel that that is kind of a reflection on people's sense of maybe where they really sit in Irish society, maybe a sense that Jewish people aren't and maybe never will be accepted as fully Irish, because to be Irish is kind of linked in with a very particular notion of identity. And Simon has touched on that, you know, the strong Catholic identity that the state acquired since independence. And, you know, it's questionable whether that has room, or what room that has for other identities. And I mean, I think we'll see that kind of issue develop as Ireland is gradually becoming more cosmopolitan and seeing a lot more immigration and the presence of many more minority groups. But it's still, I mean, a hyphenated identity is still unusual, like something and Irish. We're used to the notion of being Irish Jewish, but Irish African or Irish Chinese, it's not something that kind of comes naturally. So I think we've got a lot of work left to do in Irish society, really, to become more accepting of and a little bit more tolerant and accepting of minorities, and to see other people as equals, not as strangers to be tolerated, but to accept people who are not from the traditional Irish background as genuinely, authentically Irish.
Thank you, Natalie, for your thoughts on that. And would you like to add anything, Ruti or Simon, in particular, or tell us anything about education and that aspect of identity, perhaps? Simon, is that something that you could concur with Natalie on the issue of identity?
Sure. I'm absolutely no expert in any way, shape, or form about the history of things, and I was sort of I would be certainly guilty of what Natalie was saying there, that I wasn't aware that there was this kind of almost rewriting of history, that Irish Jews are quite more nationalist, but it makes absolute sense. And I suppose you tend to focus on the likes of Bob Briscoe and all that kind of, who sort of were in the history books, let's say, rather than the general Jewish population. And it also makes sense, obviously, around, I suppose, the time of independence, that most Irish people at the time weren't really much in favour of, were more in favour of a home rule rather than a complete separatist thing. They sort of, in a way, yeah, it all makes quite a bit of sense. However, after independence did come, the Catholic influence in Ireland did become very, very strong. And it was only until 1978, the first I suppose, non-religious school would have opened in Dublin, which has now become part of a network called Educate Together, which I work in. It's the only system I can kind of, I suppose, ethically work in or morally work in. So as I said in my talk, 95% of primary schools in Ireland run under a sort of a Christian ethos, mostly Catholic, 90% Catholic, 5% other Christian faiths. And what that does, I suppose, is every child goes to primary school in Ireland. So you're already from the age of 4, either by osmosis or actual direct teaching, you're taught a view of the world from a particular lens, and it becomes quite normalized, very much in the same way, in a way that I went to a Jewish school and found, life through a Jewish lens completely normalized until I left my education, my primary and secondary education. I went into a world where nobody had a clue of what I was talking about, or wouldn't be familiar with it. So, I mean, when you have a population, where 95% of people are taught through a particular lens, it's quite natural that becomes the national lens, and that gives, I suppose, that probably, I suppose gives a view of the world, even if we're moving away from it kind of gradually. I mean, we're seeing a lot more, movement away from traditional values. We've had 2 referenda in the last decade where, for example, marriage equality in 2016 was a huge, I suppose, triumph, let's say, for secularism, but as well as a movement away from, I suppose, the clutches of traditional Catholic values. So I don't know. We're definitely in a transition. We're way too late to the game, but we have to start where we are. I'd say we're about a generation and a half into a multicultural Ireland, and it's only growing. And I think with that, we need to embrace it rather than fight it, because we've seen what fighting multiculturalism has done in other countries, and we certainly don't want that to happen.
Thank you. And Ruti, is there anything you can add, perhaps briefly, because we've also got quite a few questions coming in now?
No, I'm very happy for you to go on to the next question. I mean, I'm talking to quite a lot of elderly Cork residents that aren't Jewish as well. And once or twice when I have broached the subject of, what kind of politics did your Jewish neighbours have? It was like, well, they just, they of course, of course they were, Republican, but that's what the neighbours were, and I suppose you fitted in. But I haven't actually broached that much in those conversations yet, but I will now.
Okay, thank you, Ruti. Thanks for that. Okay, we've got some more questions here. Someone asking, tell us more about the Limerick pogrom. I think that was Steven that mentioned it. No, who mentioned the Limerick pogrom? Simon.
I briefly mentioned it now, and again, I wouldn't have a huge expertise in it at all, but I'd say Natalie does, so I'm going to pass on to Natalie if that's all right.
Yes, I've looked at the Limerick boycott in my research. So the first thing I would say is that pogrom is a complete misnomer. It's acquired, the events in Limerick have acquired this tag of pogrom, which is something that really needs to be challenged and examined more closely as to where it came from and why it's there. The events of 1904 were an economic boycott that was instigated by a priest in the Redemptorist order, Father John Cray, who advised his congregation to boycott Jewish traders in the city. And like many of the other provincial Jewish immigrant communities, a lot of Limerick Jews were involved in the weekly hire purchase trade, selling goods on credit, and maybe offering small cash loans on the side. So when Cray asked or demanded for people to stop trading, people took this as a reason to default on their business with Jewish traders. So it caused quite a lot of problems in the city, mostly, as far as I can tell, among the poorer Jews. The boycott seems to have been concentrated more in the city. So those who could afford to travel for business outside of the city were able to survive, and those who had employees that they could let go also kind of came through it. So it would have affected the poorer Jews in Limerick worse. But there are a lot of rumours, and there's a lot of misinformation again about the Limerick boycott. Aside from the name and the claims that it destroyed and decimated the community, which, if you look at census figures, are just, not accurate. But there's a lot of work that still remains to be done on it. And actually, I'm in the process of getting together with some other scholars to look at it from various different perspectives. And we're planning to bring out a collection of essays on the subject eventually in the next year or two.
Thank you.
So if anyone's interested in finding out more in the future.
Natalie, when did the last Jews leave Limerick?
I have absolutely no idea, but the community was still there, I think, up until maybe the 1940s or beyond that. But certainly in the 1920s, the figures, and the 30s even, the figures were not dissimilar to the figures for the early 1900s. So like a lot of communities, it was very transient. There were a lot of comings and goings. So the boycott didn't seriously affect the community. It just dwindled, probably for natural causes, or because of natural causes.
Thank you. Okay.
And just to say, sorry, can I just to say, of course, there are Jews living in Limerick now, but again, like Cork, not from that original community. I don't know if there's anybody that's gone back that's related to that original community, but there's certainly some Jews living there now, but just affiliating to the Munster Jewish community, which is this wide geographic.
Thanks, Ruti. It's good to know that they're still there. Okay, or they've come back. Okay, we've got a question about Irish Jewish soldiers in the First World War. Does anyone know about Jews in the First World War from Ireland? Is that something our panel can
Rebecca, sorry.
enlighten us on? Yes.
No, sorry, Rebecca, this is Vivi. It's just that I've got another meeting that I have to go to, and I've got a question about Yiddish. Can I just cue jump for a moment?
Sorry. Yes, Vivi.
You missed out on your list. Is that okay?
That's okay. Yes, let's do that.
Okay. Sorry to leap in there, and I don't think I was really cue jumping. Well, I have a question about Yiddish, because I'm a researcher into Yiddish material in London. And in the London Yiddish press, there is a fair amount of discussion about Ireland. So from the 1880s, I mean, key people like Morris Winchevsky, who was the socialist leader, was writing articles about Ireland. He was very anti-home rule and sort of wanting connections rather than nationalism. So he even wrote poetry about it. And I have a feeling later on in its site, which was the Jewish Times, they had regional, provincial. It was really interesting what you were saying, Natalie, about it, sort of Dublin being a province of London, because I think in the provincial roundups, you sometimes had stuff from Dublin. I can't swear to it. I know Jitlovsky also wrote stuff about the connection wrote about Ireland. And I think there was probably, I'm pretty sure there was some London Yiddish theatre that ended up in Dublin. So I just wondered really what any of you knew about when the Yiddish speaking immigrants came, about any Yiddish cultural stuff going on in either Dublin or any of the other places in Ireland. And whether also there was a lot of union activity in London, and whether that sort of Jewish union activity had any connection also with things that might have been going on in Ireland. And that's from around the mid 1880s to say the 1920s, something like that. Maybe Natalie, you got anything?
I don't mind, if you don't mind me jumping in, I don't have a lot of information, but I can possibly point you in a direction. Ray Rivlin wrote a really good book called Jewish Ireland, and I'm 99% sure she talks about the entertainment business and Irish Jewish people that were involved in that. And I think Yiddish was part of it. Now, I read it while I was researching Jewtown, looking for other stuff, but I certainly remember, I'm pretty sure there's some stuff about Yiddish in there. I guess that would have been a language spoken by quite a lot of Jewish people, I suppose, in the early part of the 20th century. But as I said, that's as much as I can give you, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there was, I don't know an awful lot either, but as to whether there was much Yiddish cultural activity, but the Jewish Dramatic Society did perform in Yiddish, and Barry Montgomery has written a piece about that recently, an essay. And he would be somebody to contact about that. As regards socialism, there's very little information, and it's very hard actually to unpick the whole subject of class within the Irish Jewish community, because it tends to be presented as really monocultural, and there's very little. It's just very hard to decode it, and there seemed really to have been two levels of class, like one kind of an economic notion of class, and then a moral notion of class, and where, you know, how important socialism was within that is quite hard to detect. Katrina Goldstone has just recently published a book on left-wing Irish activity, but this is at a later period. So it's really, there's really very little to say about it. There was James Connolly produced a leaflet in Yiddish, kind of a manifesto, an election manifesto in Yiddish, and oh goodness, I've forgotten the name of. Sorry.
When was that?
1902, I think. And there was somebody else whose name I've forgotten, who was involved in socialist and communist activity later on in London. I just can't think of the name of the family offhand. But, and I'd love to find out more about your research, actually. It sounds really interesting.
Has Tricia Kessler written about the ribbon factories or the factories that Jewish immigrants set up?
Yes, but I'm not sure how to what extent Yiddish would come into that.
Or whether the union stuff maybe would come in.
Yeah, but it was more the Jews were. It was Jews who established the factories, but the workers were Irish.
Okay.
Okay, well, I hope that's helped a bit.
Well, thank you very much, and apologies, I have to whiz off.
But okay. You were actually next in the queue. Sorry, I missed you.
Okay.
Sorry, Vivi. No queue jumping going on here. And if you might have seen our issue, we've got something on the writers Leslie Dyken and Michael Sayers, who, again, as Natalie said, they're later. There's not the Yiddish connection, but that's in a piece by Katrina Goldstone, which is very interesting. So good luck with your research into that. It sounds very interesting. Okay, we have got a question from Adrian Banks about Jews in the First World War. I don't know if Adrian, we can go to Adrian. Would she like to ask her question and give us a bit of background to that? No, Adrian. Okay. Is that something that any of you on our panel can talk about? Jewish soldiers in the First World War? No, not particularly.
I can point people to a video on the Ulster History Hub on YouTube on the subject of Jewish soldiers and the Jewish community generally in Belfast during the First World War. So I can certainly share the link to that if people are interested.
And I mean, I know there's a wider project, and the name of it escapes me. If anyone can fill me in, that would be great. But it's looking at the contribution of Jewish soldiers in general to.
We were there too, isn't that what it's called?
We were there too. That's it. Yes, that's it. They might have some information. Yeah. Okay, let's go on because there are a few more, and time is moving on. So we've got David Phillips. Well, he's given a suggestion to Vivi, I think, that there might be programs of the Jewish Dramatic Society in Yiddish in the Irish Jewish Museum in Dublin. And we have got a question actually from RS Aleph, which is perhaps a good one to end on. Aviva, I'm seeing a question from Anthony in the audience wants to respond to this, but I'm not sure which question it is he wants to respond to. Before we go to AS Aleph, have we got an Anthony who wants to respond to?
Fine.
What does he want to respond to, Anthony?
Okay, fine, yeah. I'd be very interested to know what the attitude of the Irish community, Jewish community was, North and South, towards the aspirations of Zionism. I mean, obviously Herzog is there as an example, you know, going towards Israel. But you know, that's what I'd be very interested in, Zionism. As it became very popular in England, was that aspiration shared in Ireland?
I think so, in Cork anyway, yes. From people I've spoken to, yeah, for sure.
Belfast, you can see, for example, the rabbis that they choose. We mentioned Herzog, but they would have all belonged to the kind of religious Zionist camp for much of its history. There was a plethora of Zionist organizations and committees, fundraising, of course, but also more practical. I remember in the 80s, we had an Aliyah society that was for a number of families leaving the frying pan of Ulster in the 1980s to the fire of the Middle East. So there was always a Zionist element, of course. A community has people with different perspectives, different points of view. But I think if you wanted to characterize, people were asking me about the political character of the Belfast Jewish community. I think Zionism is a very important part of that story.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Dublin community has always been very Zionist as well. And actually an interesting point about it is that there doesn't seem to have been any significant conflict between a more established Anglicized section of the community and the immigrant community on Zionism, perhaps because of the political situation here, where nationalists could identify with Zionism, with Jewish nationalism, and then Protestants kind of identified with the biblical eschatological side of it. So yeah, it's interesting, but there's very little evidence of dissent of any kind about Zionism here, but that's not to say that it didn't exist, of course.
I don't think I mean, I suppose I come from the same generation as Natalie, and we've grown up in the same community, so similar kind of thing. I mean, there are a lot of Zionist organizations I certainly would have been familiar with growing up. There was a lot of youth organizations, and then you had the JNF and Wizzo and all the rest of them, which I imagine have British equivalents. So yeah, I mean, I think it was, yeah, there was, as Natalie was saying, I don't ever recall there being a conflict. I think it was just was what it was.
Ruti, anything you want to add?
Yeah, can I put a bit of note of controversy here? I've been reading in the Jewish press very strong pro-Palestinian and pro-boycott sentiment in the Irish Dáil lately. Very much fostered by the Gaza situation and so on and so forth. So, that's,
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's no denying that. There is certainly a shift, and there's a large Palestinian solidarity movement in Ireland. Certainly in the Republic of Ireland and up north, it's very polarized, isn't it? That you've got, if you're in a unionist area, you seem to be seeing Israeli flags hanging around, and in the nationalist area, Palestinian flags hanging around. They like their flags up there, but in the south, it certainly seems that that's the case. Although there are obviously the opposing views. The Irish-Israel Friendship League, I think, it certainly is something I remember being around when I was growing up. I'm sure if that's still in existence, but there are. It's a hard one really to know, because I think and I think either mistakenly or not mistakenly or whatever it be, the sort of the Catholic population of Ireland seem to identify a little bit with the Palestinian situation, with the idea of occupation and so on and so forth, and obviously the Protestant side of things may take a different view, but that's very general and probably not entirely accurate either. But it's like the situation, it's very complicated. So it's very hard to simplify it really that much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. I hope that has helped with some thoughts on your question. Let's go to a final question now, I think. Yes, so we're going to go to Angelina from County Down, who had the question that I was reading out as RS Aleph. It's actually Angelina from County Down. Can we go over to you? You've got a question which would be a good one to end on about the future for Judaism in Ireland, in the north and south. And I think that would be a great one for all of our panel to answer. So you go ahead and ask them.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so what we've just said about this polarization in the north, and there's a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel mentality often, then a very small number of Jews in the north. I wonder what the future of Judaism looks like in the whole of Ireland, what form that will take, and what it means for the future of Judaism in Ireland as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Panel, where should we kick off? Ruti, do you want to?
Yeah, I hide out near the seaside and don't go into the city very much. But so, I'm not seeing what is going on at UCC and that kind of thing. But of course, there are more Palestinian supporters than Jews. But, you've just got people mixing those two things up. So, as happens all over the world. So I think Cork really, loves the fact it had a thriving Jewish community. And, most people are meeting, because I'm a musician, so it's through music, and they love all things Jewish and cultural. They don't love Israel. But, Munster Jewish community is, I think, sort of defining itself as non-political, and, because there's so many different opinions within its members who are Irish and Israeli and English and Dutch church, and so it's just, you know, it's a cultural group, and maybe that is the way that, and I only know my little place in it all, but maybe that's the way that it will survive, is by being non-political and being cultural. I'm sure it's very different in Dublin because that's a different world, but you know, I mean, we don't have a shul, you know, there's sort of there's very little to attack in Cork, actually, you know, by anyone that doesn't like the look of it. So it's an unusual community in that way, that it doesn't have its own building, you know, it's not very visible. There's yeah, it's a quiet community, I suppose, in that way. And that's possibly how it will survive. But I think that's very different from most Jewish communities that do have some sort of shul or meeting room. And the Munster Jewish community are talking about, like, we need to have a regular place to meet, and it might be in a church hall, you know. But yeah, I don't think we're typical. I think we're very atypical. I'm sure you others will agree with that.
I heard, Ruti, over lockdown and the whole of the past year, that there'd be a bit of a new lease of life connecting up with Brooklyn, with a synagogue in Brooklyn from Munster Jewish community. So I think Zoom and you know, technology from COVID has really helped many small communities in many ways.
Absolutely, and there's a rabbi from a community in Boston who has a holiday home in Cork County. So, you know, so he comes. So I think, yeah, there's this kind of, you know, blowing in and out kind of vibe to our community, which, and of course, you know, people just love Cork because it's so special. So it's, yeah, I think it'll survive because people will always come to the area.
We lost Ruti.
Oh, have you lost me? I am still here.
No, you're still here.
Oh, somebody went very echoey.
I think Rebecca's frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think it's just Rebecca's connection that has cut out for a moment. But
Okay.
if you guys want to carry on talking?
Yeah, maybe somebody else anyway from a different community.
I'll give a more negative perspective, because one of the things that I do, I co-chair the Northern Ireland Friends of Israel, and trying to pick up the pieces of what's been going on recently. The idea that we can survive on a cultural level. Well, in Northern Ireland, we've had the Linen Hall Library, which is a major cultural institution, put on an event regarding the centenary of Rabbi Herzog's, the centenary of Chaim Herzog's birth in Belfast. The staff there came under intense bullying after that event. We were going to have a subsequent event at the library, which was actually about Jewish servicemen during the Second World War. The library asked, could we please not have it because they don't want to have their staff put in danger. We had a stall selling cosmetics in a shopping centre in Belfast had to shut following attacks, physical attacks on the staff members of an Israeli-owned stall in the shopping centre. I could go on. Derry City Council actually voted that to have me speak to it would be a disgrace to the city because I'm a Zionist. So I don't know what the future holds. So that's, you know, negative. Would I want to bring up children in that kind of environment? No, I wouldn't. I do live in London. I can see things happening here that I'm very concerned about. But I think the situation in parts of Ireland, North and South, is extremely disturbing. Unless you're prepared to knuckle down and just let that go on around you and ignore it, I think we're in for a very rough ride as a community. I don't think you can attract young Jews to that kind of environment.
Okay, I'm back. Having talked about technology, I then got cut off. But yeah, thank you, Stephen. I heard most of what you said there. Natalie, do you want to talk a little bit about the future?
Well, I suppose there's a big question mark over the future in a religious sense. What's going to happen as the community kind of shrinks, the old, so-called old community shrinks, and we're trying to find kind of a middle ground between what's been here before and what may be here in the future. we have quite a large Israeli contingent, but mostly not really interested in Judaism as a religion, but more in a cultural sense. So it's very hard to say where things are going to go in the future. I think we have to look to other more creative and diverse concepts of Jewish identity, such as Ruti touched on, the Munster community. Maybe that's the future. Also, as you say, Zoom has been very helpful because it's given smaller communities access to so much more that's going on in the Jewish world. And it's also allowed other people an insight into our community here. But as to what the future holds, I think, well, I suppose to be more positive, there is a lot going on at the communal level, attempts to kind of restart communal activity. And some of the organizations, such as BBYO, and things, you know, to get things going, more social, more cultural things. So hopefully it's not all doom and gloom, but we have to watch this space, really.
Thank you, Natalie. And some final thoughts from Simon. And then I think, Ruti, will you play us out as we'll start to tie up tonight? Anything you'd like to add to that, Simon?
Sure. Yeah, I reckon, I suppose the future of the Irish Jewish community, I suppose, depends on the people in it, and how they embrace, I suppose, like all religions now, the rise in secularism and move away, I suppose, in a way to a post-religious society. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, working within the education sector, while most of our schools are Catholic in name, very little Catholicism, I mean, particularly happens in a way. I mean, it does certainly happen, but the people going to the schools, it's I don't know, matches and dispatches, and I think seems to be are the only actual religious things that are happening. You know, the sacraments, the communions, confirmations, so on. But outside of that, people don't go to church, and I imagine that's quite similar with the Jewish community or any other minority faith, that you're really you're trying to find this new way of keeping a community going, and still, I suppose, be able to name yourself Jewish or whatever. I think the just going on Angeline's question around this Israeli Palestinian kind of situation and Judaism and all that sort of stuff. I find that it can become that can sort of overwhelm and become part of the what it is to be Jewish, you know, and or what it is, you know, to be Zionist and being the same thing and all that kind of stuff. And I think we have to be careful what we do in that. I certainly think it should be separate, but I think if that becomes a narrative, there's a danger ahead, really, and it won't work well for any community. Really, I think we need to keep apolitical, as Ruti said, and I think culture, arts, all that sort of stuff is a very, very nice tool that gives you the commonalities rather than the differences. So they're only my thoughts.
Thank you, Simon. That's a great way to end what's been a completely fascinating evening. We've covered so much ground. So thank you very much to all of my panel from wherever you've beamed in from. I think you've all given us reason to believe that there are very positive signs for the future for the Irish community, the Jewish Irish community. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and for your questions. So that leaves me to go to Ruti, who's going to play us out. And happy Bloomsday.
Happy Bloomsday, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ruti. And for those of you still here, you can check out our next events on the Jewish Renaissance website. Thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Ruti, for your wonderful music.
Thank you so much.